I want to take some time to show you a really great effect that you can apply to links to make them look like 3D buttons. It's just kind of a fun trick, and it's something you can do purely with CSS without any images whatsoever. But this is what it looks like on the page, and you can see it has a hover effect when I put my mouse over it, and then when I click the button, you actually get the satisfaction of it looking like you're pressing something. So you're giving that user lots and lots of feedback saying that this is a clickable thing that you can interact with, and then when you interact with it, it actually looks like it's doing something. Of course, it isn't actually doing anything, but through some 3D visual trickery, we can make that effect happen, and it's not too difficult. So let's get into some code and see how we do that. So when we start out with that page, it is relatively simple. I've got a link that says click me here in the middle of the page, and I've put that in the middle of a div and centered it in the page just to make it a little bit easier to keep an eye on it and see what it's doing. The link itself here is plain. It doesn't go to anything. The one thing I am going to do to it, though, is I'm going to add a class because I want to be able to decide when something is a button versus other links on the page, which I might want to just look like plain links. So everything I do here is going to be associated with the button class. And so let's get started with filling in some of those things. So the first thing I want to do is I'm going to set the display to inline block, which allows that button to be inline with text, but also have its own defined area. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set the position to relative. All this does is allow me to shift the button a few pixels to achieve that 3D clicking effect. I'm going to set a height of 40 pixels and a width of 120 pixels to define the height and width of the button. That way, if I have more than one button, I can make them all look exactly the same size for uniformity. I'm going to set a border of 2 pixels, and since I'm going to use a standard color, 2 pixels, and we'll just make it black and a solid border. There are other settings you can throw in there, other choices you can make, and I'll let you play around with those. We're going to have a border radius on this because I want the corners to be curved, and we're going to make the border radius 10 pixels, which will give it a nice rounded look. And then we are going to set the font family, and I'm going to use Impact, which is a pretty common font, and I'm going to use Arial Black as a backup, and if those aren't available, it will just default to whatever the system's sans serif font is. For size, I'm going to go to 24 pixels, and that ought to fill up the button pretty well. And we're going to specify the color as black as well. And we're going to remove the underline by doing text decoration none. And so this will give me, so far, a very plain looking button. Okay, so we're getting there. It's not 3D or very cool looking yet, but let's keep going here. I'm going to align the text align. I'm going to align it center, and when I do that, you can see here that it's centered horizontally. I want to center it vertically, and I'm going to use the line height property to do that. So I'm going to create a line height, and I'm going to set that to the same height as the container so that that text will be perfectly centered in that container. And I'm going to also, let's shift over really quick, and I'm going to use the CSS gradient generator to create a gradient that that fits really well with what I want to do. So I'm going to take that and I'm going to copy and paste that right into the background, just like that. And I forgot to get one part of that, which is my backup, my fallback background color. In case somebody's browser doesn't have that, then the button will just appear this color of turquoise here. So if I take a look at that now, that button's starting to look like what I want it to look like. I've got a few more things that I like to do. And the first thing I would like to do is I'm going to throw a box shadow around that. So I'm going to use box shadow. And for the box shadow, I'm actually going to specify an RGBA value for the color. It's useful because I can set a transparency. So I'm going to go with a dark gray, 30, 30, 30, and then the opacity I'm going to set to 65%, so it's partially transparent. The nice thing about that is it will show the background when it's looking through. And then for the other values, I'm going to set it off center to the right and down 5 pixels each. And then the blur I'm going to set to 10 pixels. So that's the blur distance. So we've got the color, the distance to the right from the main object, the distance down from the main object, and then the blur distance. Let's take a look at where we're at with this now. So with this, I have a pretty good looking button here. A couple more things I want to do. I'm going to throw in a text shadow, and the text shadow uses a similar arrangement to the box shadow, except it is going to actually put a shadow on the text. And I'm using white for that because what it does is it just makes the text pop out a little bit more, which makes it a little bit more readable. And then the very last thing I'm going to do, and you'll see why I do this later, is I am going to move it up 3 pixels and to the left 3 pixels. So that's why there's a negative value. Negative values on the top means you're moving it up, and negative values on the left-hand side means you're moving it to the left 3 pixels. And that is so when I click that button, it's going to actually shift down and to the right when I use a pseudo class. So the first thing I want to do is the hover pseudo class. And so I'm going to say button and then colon hover, which will allow me to apply styles for whenever that button is rolled over on the mouse. And all I'm going to do is take each of these colors in this gradient and I'm going to lighten them up just a little bit. And that allows me to create an effect that makes it look like it's lighting up or illuminating. So I'm going to paste those in. Those are straight out of the gradient generator there. And now with the hover effect applied, I have something that looks like this. Okay, so you can see it's got that nice effect where it still has a gradient, but it looks like it's just sort of lighting up. All I did was go into the gradient editor and lighten each of those colors just a little bit. You don't need too much, although you can choose whatever effect you want there. So the last thing I want to do is I want to make it do something when it's clicked. And so I'm going to use the active pseudo class. I'm going to use button colon active. There it is. And all I want to do is have it move, and I want to change the box shadow. So I'm going to take those values. I don't need to specify everything. I just need to specify the things that I want to override. So I'm going to take those, and all I'm going to do is change those values to 0. So it's going to move back into its original place, and then we're going to move the shadow a little bit, but we're also, if you look at a shadow, the closer something gets to the surface, the less spread out the shadow tends to be. So I'm going to do the spread of the shadow from 10 down to 5 pixels. So now it'll have the hover effect and the active effect, which is when it's being clicked. And so there's the hover effect again. And then when you click it, you have that nice little effect where the button shifts down to the right just a little bit. The shadow gets a little tighter and it looks like a 3D button. So that's just some fun that you can have with CSS. And the really cool thing about this is now that I've defined this as a class, I can create additional buttons quite easily. Okay, so there's another link, right? Just a plain link until I add the class of button. And just by adding that class to that link, I get a nice button that takes on all of those same characteristics. So some really cool, pretty powerful stuff you can use for your website with CSS, but it's kind of fun to play around with some of those effects sometimes.